Who are you, and where are
I'm
you?
Steve Millet. I work on the Indigo team and the Indigo project. I'm an architect on the team. I've been with the team probably from within a few months of its inception, so the last 4 years.
So this is my first look at Indigo, so I really have very little conception of what it is, other than reading some of the blogs that have been posted over the last week or so. Um, what is it? That's good.
It's really just our next generation platform for doing web services and a messaging infrastructure. So originally I worked with the ASP.NET team and was very involved in ASMX technology, which is our current web service technology platform. And the Indigo team was really formulated to take web services to the next level. Originally we looked at what is the next killer app for web service, and we were looking at services in particular. And what we realized is, as a platform, it was still so young, there were so many missing pieces. For instance, how do you do security in a web services environment? How do you do reliability? How do you flow transactions? And we identified all these sort of common cross-cutting features that a web services platform needed, and that's really what prompted Indigo as this next messaging platform.
Does it replace anything that you know developers are currently using?
Yeah, so originally it was focused strictly on web services, and what we realized, there's lots of messaging technology, and in fact we had a bit of a confusing story for customers, like when do I use remoting versus ASMX, when do I use DCOM or enterprise services. And so another one of the goals of Indigo was to just tie all those technologies together and create one unified messaging platform that could cover the whole spectrum of what those technologies were attempting to do.
Right. Now this is a tool set for letting us do real web services, right? And use all the WSC specs. And
exactly. And
so you had to be an expert on WSC, I guess. You're one of the 10 people in the world who probably got...
I know a little bit about WSC. It was our first manifestation of proving these interop protocols. So another one of the big strategies of Indigo and web services was to set the playing field around the protocols. So if we were truly going to interoperate with other partners, we needed to agree on what the wire protocols looked like. And so the Indigo team was in fact responsible for driving a lot of the work with partners and the standards bodies to create these WS or web service standards. So once we recognized, oh, I need a way to do security with web services, I need a way to do transactions or reliability, that's really what instigated those standard protocols being defined and pushed out there.
When I download Indigo for the first time, what does it look like? And what should be the first couple of things that I try out?
Well, it's going to feel a lot like any other sort of feature in the .NET framework. You'll get what's currently called the system.service model namespace, and there's some other related namespaces under that. But essentially, the way you'll look at Indigo up front, most users, is from a service model orientation. So you will define a service class in a similar manner that you do in ASMX today, where you'll declare a contract or an interface with the sets of methods that you want to interact with, define your data types, mark those. And then really the new thing we've introduced is the concept of bindings, where this concept has been in SOAP before, but the number of binding variations in SOAP today is very limited. You can do things like say, oh, use SOAP 1 or 1.2, use HTTP, do RPC literal or RPC encoding. Very little bit in the way of bindings or policy. With all the WS standards, this gets much richer now. I can define what my security policy is. I can define, what my reliability semantics are, whether I'm flowing transactions. And so the richness of the system just got a lot bigger.
Right. What kind of developers should care about Indigo? How do you know that you're ready for Indigo, in other words?
Well, I think anybody who's doing, a distributed application should start thinking about Indigo immediately. And many of the applications in the world are moving in that direction, being distributed. More apps are moving off a single machine to multi-machines and connections between machines. So Indigo is totally targeted at that. We also thought about Indigo when we designed it in the long run to be the right architecture, scaling, up and out and in. And so we do think about using Indigo, and we have protocols and transport set up for using Indigo on box. So we have a named pipe transport which you can use to do cross-process communication on a box. So
now, do you need Longhorn for Indigo, or what OSs does it run?
no, Indigo is currently slated to work with XP SP2 and with Win 2K3 SP1, and then clearly things get better and better as we move to Longhorn. We're completely part of the Longhorn push. So.
And do I need a specific Visual Studio to work with it, or?
Yeah, you'll have to be Whitby platform compatible, so that would be Visual Studio 8.0.
And you get all this stuff on MSDN Universal, I guess?
I believe you can get it all there, yeah.
Okay.
We are now just getting in part of the customer technology previews, and so the next one that goes out will include Indigo and Avalon, which is the UI framework that's coming out
right
as part of the Longhorn.
Can you tell us about some of the kinds of systems that you would expect to be built with Longhorn, or with Indigo? Sorry.
Again, any sort of distributed application that you see out in the world today. So less focused on UI and more on data. Now you can certainly back a UI with data fetching technology, and web services is a way to do that. But anything you see today on the web, shopping applications, a brokerage application, mailbox applications, are all well suited, especially as we see richer clients come along, because then that UI can simply be rendered on the client, and it can simply use web services to fetch data or do logic,
right,
or perform functions.
So if I have a multi-tier app today done in BB6, how hard would it be to get that into the new world, the Indigo world?
It shouldn't be hard depending on how you're doing your communication. Certainly if you were using ASMX technology to do your web service communication, it would be quite an easy transition to Indigo, and you would be able to leverage the additional features we provide over ASMX.
Okay.
Say you were using remoting or enterprise services, we're actually trying to make a fairly easy transition as well. Remoting is a little bit more difficult depending on how tightly coupled you were using remoting. One of the commitments we've sort of made in the Indigo messaging platform is to what we call a service-oriented architecture, which is really predicated around keeping things loosely coupled. So,
what does that mean? Because I've heard you and Don Bob's talking about that, loosely coupled.
It essentially means when I'm doing remote method calls, I exchange data by value. In other words, it's okay to pass data back and forth and manipulate that data, but keeping pointers or references to data is problematic in a distributed system. When we did everything on machine, pointers were used to point at the same place in memory, and even then you had issues with people stomping on each other and keeping ref counts around, and that's where COM grew up with add ref, release, and all that. In a distributed system, that's very difficult to do because it's hard to keep track of who's got access to what resources. So the model there is what we call a loosely coupled one, where basically you're doing data passing and you don't keep references to fine-grained things. Now, we do have the ability to keep references at sort of a very high-grain level. For instance, we do have the concept of a service instance that can come into existence and the ability to potentially pass a reference to that. But
right.
As far as ref counting or keeping track of that instance, it may still be there, or you may end up getting a new instance. So it's just a much looser coupled system.
Tell me about what is service orientation, because that seems to be the hype word of the moment.
It is, and it's really all about using these loosely coupled architectural principles to implement a distributed system.
Okay.
So don't do things tightly coupled, because you may start with a system that you're all running on box and all seems fine, but as soon as you decide for scale out reasons or for replication reasons or partitioning reasons, you need to break your application apart onto multiple machines or multiple processes, you run into trouble when you've done things tightly coupled.
Do you have like 5 rules of how to build a service-oriented architecture, or any I don't know, mistakes that you see people making when they're first trying to get into this world?
Hopefully Indigo will kind of keep you on the right path, because when you define an interface or what we call a contract in a service or an architecture, you're really forced into doing things by value. We don't make it easy to pass object references across processes or machines. So that's the main thing to stay away from. People often ask, like, well, how do I know when to do that or not? If you ever think, for any reason, you might want to make these calls cross-process or cross-machine, you should think about doing it in a loosely coupled fashion. And even our support in DCOM and enterprise services, we're moving people in that direction because the applications scale, deployment characteristics, everything gets better.
Let me just close the door because I hear some people down the hall. Any other rules or tips that as you bring developers into this new world, into the Indigo world?
Not really. This is a big subject into itself. I'm sure there's old books, and many times we have email threads talking about what are all the principles and things you can do. We've tried to be a little bit careful with Indigo not to promote overall an architecture for how you want to write your distributed app. We've tried to leave some amount of flexibility to let you walk up to the slippery slope, but we've been careful not to let you walk off the cliff into being completely tightly coupled, because it just doesn't work well in a distributed system.
Okay. If you're talking to a VB6 programmer, because there's a lot of them out there, right? And maybe doesn't understand object orientation very well, and maybe hasn't built a distributed system, but is trying to get into this new world, where would you have them start? What sort of path would you take them down?
Well, it depends.
What kinds of things does he need to learn or she need to learn to get into the new distributed world where you can build scalable apps? Where they might have been building an app for a work group.
Well, hopefully the transition, like to VB.net, isn't too bad, and then this idea of using and writing web services. The programming model is really still predicated on defining a class with methods or using an interface. Now, interfaces are a little foreign to the VB user. In ASMX, we actually the primary model was you just defined a class and you identified with attributes those methods which you wanted to allow to be done remotely or between distributed systems. In Indigo, we're really trying to get a little more formal and say, let's define that as an interface, and we really think of that as the contract. That is the contract by which two parties can exchange data. And then many of the things people do today that were sort of implicit, we try to make more explicit. For instance, a contract may be simple request replies, for instance. Give me the zip code in New Jersey, in Trenton or something. Like, that's a one-off request reply that it's not stateful, there's no session required. Where there's other contracts where, we decide to exchange a set of information with multiple request replies or messages. Today, that hasn't ever been formalized. You just kind of know it when you're talking to that service, and people use HTTP cookies and things to keep track of sessions. We've really tried to get more formal and to go about the different types of communications patterns and what those requirements are, so that when we describe a contract, still using WSDL, we can just be more explicit about what is the contract of communication between two parties.
Right.
Again, for the VB user, depending on how complex he wants to get, I think he can start just by defining classes that are basically RPC in appearance, just request replies that are exchanging data. But that's the first thing he thinks about is, I'm exchanging data here. I'm not going to be passing, pointers to my data that he's hanging on to.
Right. If an advanced user, let's say Clemens Basters or Ingo Raymer were here, what would they be asking you about?
Well, it's funny you ask them, because they've actually been playing a lot with Indigo, and I think they've been pretty happy so far with what they've got, especially in the last 6 months to a year or so, as we've finally done the final iterations on our object model and kind of bubbled up to the top of the service model where we really think the developer is going to be grounded. So we finally got a lot of the usability issues and the factoring and layering cleaned up, so that we really present a pretty consistent and simple platform to use once you understand the model. And we've gotten crisp about the model. So the model for us is that a service is a set of endpoints, and it can have one or more endpoints. And those endpoints are places I can reach that service at some address. And an endpoint consists of a contract. What are the types of messages I can exchange with it? Its address, how do I get there? And what we call its binding or policy, which is how do I talk to it? Like, do I have to use security? If so, am I using Windows credentials or a certificate? That kind of thing. So really, we've tried to distill it down to just those concepts. Service is an endpoint, and an endpoint is our ABC, address, binding, and contract. And so once people kind of get that model, then the OM, the object model we presented, kind of naturally falls out.
Are they having? I'm sure the team is watching their blogs, and they've been writing a lot about it. Is there something that they're having trouble with that you didn't expect, or?
Not too much. I mean, they get very early bits to play with, so they hit obvious issues there, but mainly those are around bugs. And in fact, they've really been good at encouraging us to go farther in certain areas, because they'll end up digging into parts of the product, say in extensibility or in our sort of what we call our designer or builder model for extending that to support scenarios that we wanted others to plug in, but until you get people really plugging in, you don't really know all the ways they want to use that or how to improve usability there. So yeah, from my point of view, I feel good about where we're at as the first level, and now we're sort of like digging down several layers in the onion, just iterating and polishing those last few things for people.
Right. Anything surprising that you've seen people use Indigo for already in the first couple of weeks it's been out there?
Well, yeah, I haven't seen a whole lot of things yet. One of the things, that Clemens in fact has done is use our whole service models. We've sort of got this extensible designer builder approach where you kind of define the components or features you want to put in. For example, these features are things that map to, say, the WS protocols. Because the strategy there was that this is a composable architecture. So if I want to plug security in, I define this protocol WS security, and it plays at the SOAP layer as kind of its own clean layer, and it's not a monolithic protocol stack like you have in traditional transport systems. So people can plug new things in there, and then the designer is all predicated about, well, if people do plug this new functionality in, how do I represent that in the object model? And so he's also been very big on WSDL and stuff, so our designer and builder has turned out to be a real good way to sort of manipulate WSDL and extend that and define things abstractly that can then be built or turned into a concrete runtime implementation to support that feature. So
right.
I was curious how many people will leverage that. Many of the early people we see at the SDRs and things are very interested in that kind of stuff. How can they?
SDRs are what do they stand for?
What do they stand for?
Design
review.
Yeah. I forget what that stands for.
Yeah,
What's that? It's my team.
It's basically internal, sometimes internal, but many of them's close part external customers who you want to give an early look at your technology and have been using our previous technology. Yeah. So they give us lots of good feedback. But yeah, many times they want to do things like plug in their own protocols, or I want to do my own compression algorithm of the data as it goes on the wire. And so it's interesting to see that the architecture we spent so much time on being clean and factored and layered and extensible, it really getting to use and it holding up pretty well. So
it doesn't seem like web services has really taken off. Is that your perception as well? Or?
Well, I think at first people had this idea that in the internet space that this was just going to take off. I think many of the things we recognized when we went down that was having a formal way to set up these contracts with whether it's session flow and all that is problematic. Security is a huge one. How on the internet do I do that? So I really think web services is starting to take hold more now in the IT world. Things like applications we have here, say HR applications, or how I can track my stock options, or I think internally corporations are starting to use that more. Also, when you just simply have distributed systems that are just services talking to other services, we really see that more. So it's less about client UIs using web service to get data and more about doing business processes between entities or tying them together. The other big deal is the interop aspect of it. By defining wire protocols, IT departments who have different systems, either using IBM or Linux or whatever, if we can all agree on what those protocols are like, I can actually wire and connect my business processes together. Whereas in the past, I was forced to make choices like, oh, we have to all agree to use WinNT and ADFS, and many times those were non-starters in any corporations, and now I have a bit more flexibility there.
Okay. Hold on just a second, my battery. No. All right, we're back after my battery change here. You were just starting to talk about interoperability between Linux and mainframes and Sun Solaris. Sun just delivered a whole bunch of equipment here, so I'm interested to see how Indigo changes that. How do you think Indigo is going to change the world of development for a corporation that has not just Microsoft stuff?
Right. Well, one of the big promises of SOAP and web services was really trying to standardize on the wire protocols. There's been efforts in the past to do things like create these cross-platform frameworks. In fact, I've worked on several of them. Very difficult thing to do. First, to convince developers to use your framework. And then just the variations in the platforms make it difficult for it really to be consistent across how your framework works across all those. Then Java came along, and that was the next promise of, oh, here if we can all agree to use this managed runtime and this language, it'll just run the same on all boxes. Well, again, that was not quite reality, as Java really got deployed on different systems and did work the same. People couldn't agree on all the same platform kits to use, that kind of thing. So really, the place you can sort of guarantee that I can own my implementation and the quirks of my platform is to really just agree on what the wire protocol looks like. And using SOAP and XML, XML became the hot thing. It was sort of the lingua franca for doing interop or connecting systems together. So and SOAP just applies that to the exchange of messages or setting up conversations between endpoints. So
that's a good question. What does Microsoft get out of Indigo? Do we charge money for it?
No, it's actually part of our developer platform, and the runtime part will just ship as part of the .NET framework that comes with our operating systems. And in Longhorn, it'll just be part of the operating system. So I think what we really get is providing. We decided, where's the value add for Microsoft? For us, it's creating the best, developer platform that gives you the richest set of features, the best performance, the best productivity. It's like, but doesn't prevent you, if you really need to, from potentially, talking to other systems. So we try to give you the best of both worlds. Clearly, we want to be able to win on we're the most productive, efficient, best platform to use. And when you're talking, Indigo to Indigo or Microsoft to Microsoft, we make the world even better. Like, we can run even faster, we can take advantage of things. But in a pure interop play, we're completely compatible with the standards that were produced. We work actively with partners and go to interop workshops to make sure our implementation works with their implementations. So, it's really trying to let enterprises and the IT pro make the right business decision for him, yet still get what he needs to get done. So he doesn't. That's one of the hard things today. Like, how do you walk in where they've already got tons of deployed systems? They're not just going to throw out all their Linux boxes, or they're using IBM for eventing or transaction managers or whatever it is, whatever technology they have. It's also helped us. I mean, things like being able to integrate things in a BizTalk server with ADFS or with other technology. And so even around the company, they're starting to rally around, the way we can even connect our distributed systems together is to use this interoperable platform.
Right. Tell us a little bit about your history. What have you done here at Microsoft?
Well, let's see.
How do you get an architect?
I've been here a while.
How do you get to be an architect? That's a pretty prestigious title, right?
I don't know. You decide that you don't like to manage people. So you don't have any other option. No, I've been here, since '93, so about 12 years. I came as a little startup with 3 or 4 other people. It was called Daily Planet Software, and it was really before the internet got started and online services were just becoming popular. And we had this idea of doing sort of a personalized newspaper data gathering thing. So even then, early on, I've always been in this idea of gathering data up and then presenting it. I had worked at Aldous on PageMaker before that, which was much into desktop publishing. So
what did you do for PageMaker?
I worked on one of their cross-platform frameworks because PageMaker had to be developed on both Windows and the Macintosh. So we had a core set of libraries that would help us do a lot of that, write the code once, and that'll work on both.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
PageMaker was one of my first apps that I learned on the Mac.
Yeah. So, but yeah, it was funny as online services came and the internet was just starting up. You know, a bunch of us who worked there were looking like we need to get more into electronic publishing and not so much page publishing. And they were a little slow for that. So we kind of did our own little spin-off. Ended up essentially joining MSN in its early days. And so they just bought us, I think, mainly for the people, some of the technology. But that was another bit of a frustrating thing being here early, is that the whole internet thing just exploded, and Internet Explorer team started up, and there was a lot of latency on the MSN management to shift from their proprietary network over to being internet-based. Yeah.
You didn't work on Blackbird, did you?
I did.
Oh, you did?
That was our first project.
All right.
So, yeah, worked on
Blackbird. Was the proprietary.
Exactly, because it was all based off MSN technology. And even within Blackbird, we told management we really should shift our focus to making this leverage, internet technologies rather than rolling all our own.
Yeah.
And eventually that happened, right? Internet Explorer got popular. MSN finally made the big shift. We give up. We really should be internet-based. And they took the core of, we were kind of like the tools for that, right? The platform. So they moved us over to the tools division, and I was the initial development manager on Visual InterDev 1.0. So that was our first product. And in fact, we did that fairly.
I've used all the products.
Yeah, we did that fairly quickly because we took a lot of those ideas and then did a very tactical thing to get a web-based tool out there, because Visual Studio had nothing. Well, in fact, Visual Studio didn't even have that name yet. In fact, that was the original name for Visual InterDev that we went for, Visual Studio, and they said, wow, that's such a good name, we should just use it for the whole tool suite. So, and then some marketing guy came out with Visual InterDev, don't ask me why, which is no more. But so I did that, and then you asked how I became an architect. Being the development manager there, I was also the primary technical driver, and I told my management that it's too difficult to do both those jobs, and I think the company has begun to realize that more. And we were one of, I think, the first teams to sort of set up this sort of two-in-a-box approach where a coworker of mine, Kelly Calvert, who was much more management focused, I was much more technical focused, and we sort of worked as a pair. And then eventually, after Visual InterDev 2.0, I moved over. We realized from a tool strategy, all of the tools should just be internet enabled, and so Brad Lovering headed up an architecture team for Visual Studio that I worked for Brad on now. So, and then after that, it was the whole .NET framework wave, and I worked a lot on the ASP.NET, doing all the web controls and the ASMX work, that sort of thing. And then after that, Indigo kind of sprung from that as the next generation of web services.
Now, what specifically have you worked on in Indigo? Do you work on a specific piece, or do you work on the whole thing?
Well, early on, very early, there weren't that many people on it. I spent a lot of time early working in the security space, helping define the early definitions of WS security and what kind of security models we needed. I've actually been kind of a jack of all trades. I think most of my strengths come when we get closer to shipping and taking sort of the architectural principles that we want and manifesting them in something we can implement, sort of bridging the gap between the pie-in-the-sky architecture and long-term vision to what is the tactical, pragmatic thing we can do.
Right. As I go around the company, I hear a lot about that the approach Microsoft has taken to security has changed. Since you were in charge of doing the
Well,
security part of
one thing so security prior to, security in a distributed system is just somewhat different. There were sort of two security pillars at Microsoft prior to that. One in just the operating system, which is all about locking down that thing and very proprietary. And the other was in the media division, where they were doing things like, how do I secure streams and do, thumbprinting on media so that I can tell whether it's legal or been tampered with. So they were coming from completely different spectrums, and we were kind of in the middle. I think some of the models have changed when you think about distributed security. Passport had this model where they would, be the pie in the sky owner of all identity, and the reality is just you're not going to get companies to do that, right? I mean, Boeing's not going to trust Passport to own all their identity. So we thought a lot about, in a distributed system, do more of federated identity systems and federated security, and be able to transition trust from one entity to another, setting up trust relationships.
Is there any security tips for developers who are using Indigo?
No, so that's one of the things, is that being on the architecture team for the first few years on this, I actually was asked to kind of move back, and I was the development manager for the security feature team for a while, just to try to help with the implementation. Security is a funny thing. It's one of those things no one wants to think about, and they just want it to work.
Yeah.
And it needs to be easy, and so there's a lot of tension between, how do we make it simple and secure so people don't have to think about it, that you're more type developer. But at the same time, people who know security want to know exactly what's going on. And so we tried to layer and factor the system such that, we can, and we're still working on it, to be quite honest. How do we make it approachable at the highest level? How do we want to model that? And so just like with the service model, we came up with this simplicity of, services are endpoints are address, contract, and binding. We want to do the same thing for security, like, which credentials do you want to present? Windows or username or certificates, and try to lead you down a set of constrained feature asks that you have, and then map that to the appropriate protocol. And then if you want to dig under a layer and really control your protocol, we still have to allow people to do that so they can really lock things down the way they want it. So security is a tough one, trying to make it both usable and, because it's such a complicated area when you get into the details of it.
Yeah. You want to give me a demo at all, or show me what it looks like?
Yeah, I can probably do that.
All right. Let me make sure the screen looks good. Yep.
Does that look all right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's the LCD, that's why.
In fact, I have a project open here. That's one of our quick start projects. So let's talk about what it looks like to create a service.
Okay.
So here I've defined this very simple interface called iCalculator, and it's just got some operations where you can add, subtract, multiply, and divide. And so how I define this as a service is I use these attributes, much like you do in ASMX. So I declare my interface as a service contract, and then I identify those operations, the methods on there that are part of the contract using operation contract. Then I go down here and I can actually implement that contract, iCalculator, in a class here. And I simply do this like I would, in any other class. I implement the interface, and in this case, simply do the operation and return the result. And that's pretty much it. In this scenario, I'm deploying this in a hosted environment. So just like with ASMX, you have sort of this activation file. We call it a .svc for service. I simply reference in there that service class that I declared called the calculator service. And when a client hits the URL, it'll activate my host, and it'll activate this code to respond to those messages. The other sort of additional thing, if we look inside my configuration, we can talk about bindings. So one of the things that defining all these WS protocols has done is it made the combinations of how I can talk to a service, much greater. So So the question is, how does the user configure those things in a simple way and know what combinations are valid? And secondarily, how do I indicate that to partners who want to use my service? So we finally got to the point where we defined sets of what we call standard bindings. So we have one we call basic profile binding, which is your traditional ASMX type thing based off the WSI basic profile. So it's just SOAP 1.1, no security, or if you want, use transport security. And then we've got another one we call the WS profile, which is basically all using WS standards, and you can kind of buy into the set of features you want. So I can use WS security if I want, I can use WS reliable messaging, I can flow transactions. You just sort of buy into the WS technologies you want to utilize on your contract. And then we have another one called net profile, where we really just leverage, even in the net profile, we kind of use the same protocol semantics that we've defined for interop. It's just that on the wire, we do things to be much more efficient. So we have a binary representation we can use. When appropriate, we can take advantage of knowing we're talking .NET to .NET. And the other thing we're doing now is supporting other transports there. We have a TCP transport we can support, we have name pipe we can support, and people can plug in others. And the fact that we call those net profile right now is just that we haven't worked to standardize those or get other partners to interop, but in the future we can certainly see that happening. So those are sort of our three sort of standard bindings, and you can tweak those with the various features you want.
Okay.
And that's kind of what I've done here. In this case, I just said, here, this goes back to my model issue. So I have a service. This is the configuration for it. It's the calculator service, and I'm going to expose a single endpoint for it, and its address. In this case, I'm going to use the base address provided by the host, which is just the SVC file. And then I'm going to use a WS profile binding, and the contract I'm implementing is the calculator. So at this endpoint, we can see that, and if we go to the service in a browser and just hit it, we do kind of like we did with ASMX. We'll give you a page, it compiles it on the fly, you can catch any compile errors there. And then if I want to look at the WSDL for it, we can do that. So this is the top level WSDL where we can see that there's one port here called the calculator port using the WS profile binding, and it can be reached at this address, which is essentially the base address, service model samples and service.svc. And then here's kind of how we expose all the policies. So because I picked that WS profile binding, here's the WSDL port type with my calculator operations, add, subtract, multiply, and divide. And then down here is the policy for it. For instance, this policy here is about the security. So it's using a symmetric binding with a client certificate, has some algorithms. And then down here, per operations, it's saying, what are the parts of the message to sign? What are the parts of the message to encrypt? In this case, we're encrypting the body. So really formalizing the idea of the policy in the binding. And that's all been integrated as part of WSDL and the WSDL binding, just to, extending that concept of the original web services.
Very cool.
So, and I can run it. I can run a client here. I've just got a simple console app in this case, but this guy will come up. He's configured with the appropriate security certificates. He'll contact the service and then make a call to each of the operations.
What are you proudest of on Indigo? I mean, if Clemens was here, what would you, or an MVP maybe who hasn't seen Indigo yet, what would you show him first?
I think I would, hopefully the simplicity of how easy it is to get a service up and running, and then I think one of the nicest things is this flexibility in the policy and how dynamic that can be. we can in fact do all this stuff dynamically. I can have a client just walk up to an endpoint, retrieve metadata, choose one of the endpoints that are available in that metadata to talk to, and just say go. And in our platform, since we understand all that policy we're producing and can consume it, we can configure a stack on the client that will be compatible and meet the requirements of that service. And so in the past with web services, that's always been sort of an out-of-band mechanism where I had to know how you today the number of variations are small, so we all have to agree, oh, I'm going to use doc literal, or I'm going to use SOAP 1.1 or 1.2. You kind of have to agree to all that stuff and kind of know it up front. As the cross-cutting feature set gets more complex, we need more of a dynamic system. So I guess that's the first thing I would sort of point out is that, oh, you want to add security, you want to add, reliability, some of these. We can do it in an interoperable way, and we can do it in a dynamic way where we can actually exchange that policy and have clients be smart enough to consume that and just be able to meet those requirements. So,
what did you guys not get right? Since it's version 1.0, what are you going to be redoing for version 2.0?
Well, I think there's a lot of things we can do to exploit this thing. Things like things we had to cut back on. Things like eventing, say, doing an eventing system, routing, all kinds of variations of routers. Can I do a relay? Can I do a firewall router? Because now that we're doing things at the SOAP layer, we can really have routers take advantage of that and do more.
Are these opportunities for customers or partners?
Yeah, both partners, customers, and internal people around the company. I mean, if they jump, because again, we do have like the ISA team that does intermediaries and firewalls, and the BizTalk team, which does the business process stuff. We can start to leverage all this stuff. I mean, we've leveraged it. We happen to own transactions on this team, so we've leveraged it around that, making transaction flow and managing distributed transactions interoperable and leveraging the platform. So we'll see. Hopefully we've got the usability point. It's been a long road because we designed this thing, thinking way ahead and trying to get the underpinnings right. And it's just in the last year or so that we've floated up to the top and tried to get the facade that we present to most developers out there. And hopefully we've got that right, yet still let you dig down and give people the ability to extend the system and plug into the system. So.
Right, cool. Anything else you think the Channel 9 world needs to know about Indigo?
I don't know. I'll be excited when it gets out there. So I think...
You'll help answer questions.
Yeah, the CTP release that's coming up will be the first release that really is very close to what the final release is going to look like.